Today's video is going to be focused around Star Wars Unlimited, specifically the Spark of Rebellion set. This is going to be the initial set and release of the game. I'm going to walk the viewers through some a little bit more advanced combat stuff that I think is very confusing. After being at numerous game events and working through this game, I find that there seems to be a little bit of confusion around some of the game rules, and I hope today to remove some of that confusion by walking you through the basic combat mechanics. First is going to be just the most basic form of combat, and that's you simply exhausting one unit and it attacks another one. So in this case, we're going to have the Battlefield Marine attack the Death Star Trooper. And basically what happens is that they're going to do 3 points of damage to each other simultaneously. And what happens is they eliminate each other and both are removed from the game. Now that in a nutshell is probably the easiest part of combat, and I think most players get it, but we're going to dive into some of the more complex mechanics, specifically on timing, when you have things that trigger on attack, things like where you have sort of a first strike capability, and then also when a unit completes an attack. Now we're going to dive into a little bit more subtle mechanics, and this is going to be mechanics where the unit gets something on attack. So as an example, we have Boba Fett, and this card says if this unit is attacking an exhausted unit that didn't enter play this round, deal 3 damage to the defender. So in this case, we're going to simulate combat between Boba Fett and the Stormtrooper. We're going to say that this Stormtrooper came into play last round, and it is exhausted from fighting. So as Boba Fett makes an attack, this on-attack event is going to trigger, and what that means is that Boba Fett's damage triggers at the beginning of the combat, not during the damage-dealing phase. So in this case, Boba Fett is going to deal 3 points of damage to the Death Star Stormtrooper and eliminate it before it has a chance to deal its damage. So it gets eliminated. Next, we're going to move onto the step where combat damage is dealt, but now there's nothing over here, so the Death Star Trooper did not get to actually hit Boba Fett. Next, we're going to go over a game mechanic where one unit is going to deal its damage before another one is allowed to retaliate, and that's on the Shoot First card, and there's a couple other cards in this set that have this ability, like Han Solo. So this card says, attack with a unit, it gets +1 power for this attack and deals its combat damage before the defender. And then it also says, you can only attack with a ready friendly unit. If the defender is defeated, it deals no combat damage to the attacker. We're going to walk through how this works. We're going to say that our Battlefield Marine is out. We're going to go ahead and play this card, which allows me to exhaust the Battlefield Marine. In this case, the power is going to go from a 3 to a 4. Then we're going to exhaust it. We're going to attack the Death Star Stormtrooper. So as per the instructions on the card, we're going to deal 4 points of damage to the Death Star Trooper, and thus the damage takes effect first, and this thing is eliminated, and therefore is not alive to counterattack the Battlefield Marine. So as you can see in this case, the ability to do damage first is a huge advantage because the defending unit is not allowed to attack back. And notice that in bold it says when this unit completes an attack, it says if the defender was defeated, you may deal 4 damage to a ground unit. So what's important about this is that in order for Zeb to use this special ability, Zeb has to survive the attack. We're going to give a quick example of where Zeb does not survive the attack. In this case, Zeb is going to attack the ATST, and thus there's no funky timing mechanics in this example. So the ATST is going to inflict 6 points of damage onto Zeb. Zeb inflicts 5 points of damage onto the ATST. Since Zeb is eliminated, the ability at the bottom of the card does not trigger. So let's go ahead and expand on this a little bit more and do a different example in which Zeb can potentially survive this attack and then also do something kind of cool at the end of combat. So in this case, we're going to say that Zeb is on one side, and then his opponent has a Cantina Braggart and a Death Star Stormtrooper. So in this example, what we are going to do is we're going to exhaust Zeb. Zeb is going to attack with his 5 power on the Cantina Braggart, who literally has no power, but has 3 points of damage. So in this case, both of these cards are going to inflict damage on one another. The Cantina Braggart can't actually do anything. Zeb's going to hit the Cantina Braggart for 5 points, thus removing it from the battlefield. Now in this case, Zeb does survive the attack and is thus able to execute this effect at the bottom of the card. So if the defender was defeated, you may deal 4 damage to a ground unit. Next, what Zeb is going to do is the Death Star Stormtrooper is going to take 4 points of damage and thus be eliminated as well. So in this case, timing does matter significantly, because if Zeb does not survive the attack, you can't trigger this effect at the bottom of the card. We're going to do a quick sort of clip when it comes to timing. So first and foremost, we're going to have cards like Boba Fett that have an effect on attack. So those are going to trigger first. Next, we have sort of these shoot first mechanics that you see on Shoot First and Han Solo, where damage is dealt by these units first. In that case, that has precedence over a normal unit. Next, we move on to normal units that don't have any sort of timing. In this case, anything that's in this category will deal damage to each other simultaneously if they're in a fight. And then finally, we have cards that have when this unit completes an attack and a triggered effect. So think of it as almost you have 4 different timelines occurring during each combat. Next, we're going to have a conversation about shielding and shields on your different units. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the Crafty Smuggler, and it has a shielded mechanic actually on it. What's great about these cards is that a shield can be placed onto them when this card comes into play. So as an example, if the Crafty Smuggler comes into play, you just simply take one of these shield tokens and place it onto the Crafty Smuggler. In general, you go ahead and just place it behind the card, and it's just easier to reference. Make sure that the text is actually exposed at the bottom, especially if you're new to the game. That way you can remember the sort of game mechanics on this. So in this case, if we have a combat example where the Crafty Smuggler comes into play and then faces off against a Death Star Stormtrooper, I'll walk you through how this combat would work. We're going to go ahead and exhaust the Crafty Smuggler. It's going to target the Death Star Stormtrooper. And then as we know about timing effects, since there's nothing strange for timing effects, these 2 units are going to fight each other and deal damage simultaneously to one another. The Crafty Smuggler is going to inflict 2 points of damage onto the Death Star Stormtrooper. At the same time, the Death Star Stormtrooper is going to inflict 3 points of damage onto the Crafty Smuggler. So in this case, what's going to happen is that the shield is going to be removed from this character, from this unit over here, and thus it's going to take 0 points of damage from that battle and from that interaction. As a note on shields, I see some confusion from players. They think that if, let's say, their unit is attacked, that they don't have to actually spend the shield. So kind of what does that mean? In cases where you have something a little bit weaker attacking something bigger, the player with the shield thinks that, hey, I don't actually have to burn the shield. You don't get a choice on when you burn the shield. If your unit, your character, ever takes 1 point of damage or more, it immediately will trigger the shield and remove it. You don't actually have a choice when the shield actually triggers. So that's kind of a subtlety, and I see a lot of players kind of ignore that rule. They say, oh, well, since the Crafty Smuggler is only going to take 1 point of damage, they're just not going to use the shield for that attack. The person with the shield, they don't have the opportunity to make that decision. As a side note, please understand that a unit in the game can have any number of shields on it. It doesn't just have to have one, but just understand that as it takes multiple sources of damage, you're going to remove each shield sort of one at a time. So as an example, let's say the Crafty Smuggler takes 1 point of damage. You're going to pull a shield off and it soaks up that entire source of damage. Next, let's say it gets hit by something huge for like 5 points of damage. So in that case, it's going to soak up all that damage and you're going to remove the second shield from it. As an extension of talking about shields, we're next going to talk about a game mechanic called Saboteur. In this example, I went ahead and placed a Jawa Scavenger onto the battlefield. It has 2 power and 1 hit point, and it has Saboteur. When this unit attacks, ignore Sentinel and defeat the defender's shields. We're going to go ahead and walk through what that means. So in this case, we're going to have the Jawa Scavenger. It's going to attack, and it's going to be attacking the Crafty Smuggler. The Crafty Smuggler actually has 2 shields on it at this course of the battle. Now, when we talk about timing and damage resolution, there is a step prior to both of these units inflicting damage upon one another in which the Saboteur effect is going to trigger. So the Saboteur effect will trigger prior to the damage resolution step, which means that the shields are removed before damage is actually dealt. So in this example, the Jawa is going to attack, and notice that it's going to defeat all of the shields on the unit, not just one of them. So it eliminates both of these shields. Next, we're going to move on to the damage resolution step, which we talked about previously. So in this case, the Crafty Smuggler is going to hit the Jawa for 2. And then the Jawa is going to hit the Crafty Smuggler also for 2 points of damage, thus eliminating both of these cards from the battle. So to fully close out the concept of Saboteur, we need to have a quick conversation about the Sentinel game mechanic, and that's what we're going to do right now. So in this case, we're going to say that we have 2 different players, and we have a Jawa Scavenger, a Battlefield Marine. We have a Cell Block Guard and our Death Star Stormtrooper. Now in this case, I'm going to introduce what's called the Sentinel Mechanic. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. It says Sentinel units in this arena can't attack your non-Sentinel units of your base. So what's going to happen? Think of the Sentinel as a blocker, and it's going to keep both your base safe and it's going to keep other units in the same arena safe. So in this case, they're both in the ground arena. So this Cell Block Guard can protect both the base and it can protect the Death Star Stormtrooper. So as an example, if I want to attack with the Battlefield Marine, I can't attack the base, nor can I attack the Death Star Stormtrooper until the Cell Block Guard is eliminated. So we're going to go ahead and go through that scenario. So thus my Battlefield Marine is going to attack, and it can't target either of these 2 cards, so it has to attack the Cell Block Guard. So in this case, both of them have a 3 power, and they would eliminate each other. So now let's go ahead and talk about one of the other powers that a Saboteur has. So we're going to go ahead and zoom in on this again. And it's going to say, when this unit attacks, ignore Sentinel and defeat the defender's shields. So we're going to go back to the battlefield, and we're going to say that the same attack is going to happen again. In this case, we are going to say that we are going to attack the base of the opposing player. I'm going to go ahead and exhaust the Jawa Scavenger. Since it has Saboteur, it goes past, and it can, avoid the Sentinel sort of keyword, and thus it hits the base for 2 points of damage. Alternatively, if I wanted to, the Jawa Scavenger could target the Death Star Stormtrooper, and in this case, the Death Star Stormtrooper would hit the Jawa for 3 points of damage, and both of these cards would be eliminated. So the Saboteur effect has sort of a cumulative effect in which it can defeat the Sentinel keyword and the shielding keyword in the game. Next, we're going to have a conversation about the ability known as Ambush. And this says, after you play this unit, it may ready and attack an enemy unit. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Most units come into play exhausted. In this case, if we want to trigger this keyword, we can ready the unit and we can use it to attack another unit. Where I see the confusion, you cannot use Ambush to attack the enemy base. That's not what the card says. So in this case, if we do the Ambush keyword, we can use it to attack, and thus we can kill and eliminate the Death Star Stormtrooper. Now, it still gets to deal its combat damage back. But what I see a lot of players do is they put an ambush unit out and then they immediately attack the enemy base. That's forbidden. We can't actually do that. It only can be used to attack a unit in play. And I think where a lot of the confusion comes into play is when, let's say, the enemy doesn't have any units in its ground arena and you play an ambush card, then you're kind of just losing the effect because you have nothing to actually target. So in that case, it just comes into play exhausted. Next, we're going to have a conversation on what happens when something's hit points are 0. And so what I'm saying is not necessarily the damage is dealt to a card, so this card has 2 hit points, but what happens if a card has 0 hit points and sort of what to do. And I think this is really confusing to new players, so I'm going to go ahead and walk you through an example of this. This is a card called Make an Opening, and it says give a unit a -2 power and -2 hit points for this phase and heal 2 damage from your base. We're going to just ignore the base thing for a second and just focus on the top. So what happens when a unit suffers -2 power and -2 hit points? So we're going to go back to our Crafty Smuggler. Notice that our Crafty Smuggler is shielded. So thus, it could take a hit and survive. But what's happening with this card right here, we're not actually doing any damage to the Crafty Smuggler. We're simply removing its hit points and setting them to 0. So as an example, although the Crafty Smuggler is shielded, it's not suffering damage. We're going to take its hit point value and drop it down to a 0. If something has 0 hit points, it's immediately defeated and removed from the game. So in this case, we would remove it. So thus, there are ways that you can defeat shields even without having to do damage to a card. So just be aware that things can be defeated in this game if the hit point maximum, so the hit point total on the card, is reduced to 0 as opposed to it taking damage. Next, we're going to talk about positively modifying something in the game. So as an example, you're going to see what's called an experience token, and a lot of cards in the game will say, hey, add an experience token to a different unit. This is just one of these token cards, and notice at the bottom it says experience and it's learned, and that's going to give a card a +1 power and a +1 overall hit point. So to simply use these, you're going to slide this underneath the card, and so thus you are going to alter both the power and the hit points of this card. So the Crafty Smuggler is going to need 1 additional point of damage. It's going to have 3 hit points as opposed to 2, and then also its power goes up, so it's going to hit harder in combat. Please note that experience, you can have as many experience tokens as you want on one of your units. You can just keep going up and up and up. So in this example, we're going to talk about an effect where something goes back to its owner's hand. This is a card called Waylay, and to zoom in, it says return a non-leader unit to its owner's hand. We're going to go ahead and do that. So let's say our opponent has this crazy Crafty Smuggler out. I mean, this is pretty dangerous at this point. It's got a high amount of power and a high amount of hit points, and we want to try to mitigate this card as much as we can. So being kind of a crafty person, we have this yellow card that's a trick that we're going to play. We're going to go ahead and play it onto the Crafty Smuggler. Where I see a lot of new players get confused is when something leaves play, what happens to sort of the attachments that are on it. So thus we have an experience token, and then we also have an upgrade on this card. So in this case, the Crafty Smuggler is going to go back to the person's hand. Now, these 2 cards no longer have a legal target because they're, so the experience token has to be placed on a unit, and then the upgrade also has to be placed on a unit. Since the Crafty Smuggler went back to the person's hand, these 2 cards no longer have a legal target, and they're thus removed from the game. So the token is just removed back to the token supply, and then the Academy training is going to go to the discard pile. So just please be aware that one of the ways to get rid of upgrades is to simply remove temporarily the unit from the game, and anything attached to it gets removed as well. The next game mechanic that we're going to talk about is Grit. As an example, we're going to look at the Occupier Siege Tank. It has a 5 power, it has 4 hit points, and we're going to zoom in on the Grit keyword. Grit simply says, this unit gets +1 for each damage on it. So what does that mean? When we look at it, if it is undamaged, it's going to be a 5/4. If it has 1 point of damage on it, it's going to be a 6/4 with 1 point of damage. Next, we're going to add a second damage token. Now it's going to be a +2. It's going to go up to a 7. And then finally, we're going to put a third damage token onto it, and it's going to be a +3, so it's going to be an 8/4 with 3 damage on it. Now, if it suffers a 4th point of damage, it's thus removed from the game, and sort of the grit is irrelevant at that point. So grit is a good way to do and inflict more damage as this unit becomes more and more heavily damaged. So think of it as it's getting buffed as it is taking damage. Next up, we're going to talk about the raid mechanics. So we're going to use the Cantina Braggart for this. And it says raid 2, this unit gets +2 power while attacking. And please notice that if this unit is defending an attack, so let's say the Battlefield Marine attacks it, this thing has 0 power and it can't really fight back because it has no power. Now this thing becomes a 2/3 when it's attacking. Now raid is extremely important because you can use raid if you're attacking, let's say, another unit, or when you're attacking the enemy base. It doesn't matter what you're actually attacking as long as you are attacking. So these cards are extremely potent if you want to eat through the enemy's base very quickly at the beginning of the game. So always be on the lookout for cheaper raid type units and characters at the beginning of the game. They can be highly effective and highly lethal to the enemy base. But just understand that there's a trade-off to that, that if something does have raid, it can be wiped out and attacked as it's being a defender. It doesn't get the bonus. Next, we're going to talk about Overwhelm. So we're going to look at our ATST, and we're going to zoom in on this. It says Overwhelm. When attacking an enemy unit, deal excess damage to the opponent's base. We're going to walk through a quick example of that. So this thing has a 6 power, and notice that our Battlefield Marine only has 3 hit points. I'll go ahead and just zoom in real quick so you can see that. So we're going to simulate the attack. The ATST attacks the Battlefield Marine and thus inflicts 6 points of damage onto the Battlefield Marine. So notice that's more than enough to kill the Battlefield Marine, but then we have 3 extra points of damage. So let's walk through what that means. So first and foremost, what's going to happen is that both of our units here are going to deal combat damage simultaneously. Battlefield Marine hits our ATST for 3 points of damage. Next, what's going to happen is the ATST hits the Battlefield Marine for 3 points of damage and thus has 3 additional points of damage. That's going to pass through and then strike the enemy base for 3 points of damage. So the Overwhelm effect is one of those keywords that only triggers when the unit is attacking, so just go ahead and keep that in mind. Next up, we're going to talk about another combat mechanic, which is the Restore Combat Mechanic. This card has Restore 1. When this unit attacks, heal 1 damage from your base. So let's go ahead and simulate that. In this case, we're playing just a 2-player game. So we're going to exhaust the Arc Fighter, and it's going to attack the enemy base. So in this example, it hits the enemy base for 2 points of damage. And then what happens is that the Restore effect goes off. So in this case, we're going to remove 1 damage from our base, and thus we're sort of healing our base. Now, there's kind of a subtlety to this, and I see a lot of players really struggle with this, so I'm going to walk you through what happens. So in this example, we're going to say that our Echo base here is completely undamaged. So if we look at the top of the card, it has 30 hit points. Now, if we attack with the Arc Fighter, we're still going to inflict 2 points of damage on Kestro City, but in this case, this restores. Okay, so when we look at the key word here, it says when this unit attacks, heal 1 damage from your base. You can never have more than 30 hit points on your base when you're using a healing action. So to heal something, it has to imply that it's damaged. So where I see a lot of new players kind of get this backwards, they think that their base is then going to go up to 31 hit points. So Restore will not give you more hit points than the maximum on your base. At this point in the game, there's no way to increase the overall hit points of your base. I would guess in the future they're going to add some sort of upgrade so thus your base can go up in hit points. So just understand, you cannot have more hit points on your base by using the restore function. So at this point in the video, I hope I've clarified a lot of the different rules that appear in Star Wars Unlimited. I really tried to focus on a lot of the misconceptions that I see new players have when they're learning this game. Now, if you're a veteran to collectible card games, I think a lot of this stuff is very intuitive and it makes sense. I think a lot of the sort of stumbling blocks I see for new players, if they're really not experienced with collectible card games and they've never seen a lot of the timing and the mechanics. So I just want to highlight in the rule book, if you actually have one, it's going to be on page 12. There's a summary of what happens during an attack, and I encourage you to just take a quick look at that if you ever have any sorts of issues or confusion with how timing works in the game. I think overall, Star Wars Unlimited is absolutely very, very polished. It feels like a really well-built game. I think kind of what led to that is that Fantasy Flight has had numerous iterations of games over the years, and they've built numerous Star Wars games, obviously. So they have like a living card game that they built. In addition to that, they've also built what's called Marvel Champions. So you see like a lot of the game mechanics that have come out of Marvel Champions. In addition to that, the Keyforge franchise, I think, has added a lot of depth to the development of this game. So really what you're looking at for Star Wars Unlimited is a game that's, then basically evolved from numerous predecessor games where they took all of the excellent mechanics. Oh, another one is going to be Star Wars Destiny. So they took a lot of those game mechanics and kind of mixed them all together. So they have a lot of experience with these game mechanics and mixing them together. So I think that's why Star Wars Unlimited feels so polished, because they've been working on a lot of these games over the years, and they took all the best components and the best parts from each of these and merged them together in Star Wars Unlimited. And that's why I think it's such an amazing game. So if you haven't played Star Wars Unlimited, and especially if you like some of the games that I mentioned before, like Star Wars Destiny or Keyforge, or even Magic players, I think would really enjoy this game. I highly recommend checking it out and playing it. I want to thank you all for joining me today, and as always, have fun gaming.